In this video, I'm going to talk about bulk fermentation, and this is the key stage of your dough. This is the prime time for your dough and where you will be developing most of its strength. Now, you've heard me talk about gluten development, and you have probably heard me very quickly talking about dough structure and how you can develop dough structure. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what dough structure means, what is the bulk fermentation stage, and how do I actually develop dough structure and know when that bulk fermentation stage is finished. Let's first discuss what bulk fermentation is. It just means that the bulk of your fermentation will happen at this stage. It's where all of your activity will come into play. It's where your starter gets happy and starts flourishing because it's just got new food of more flour and water that you've already mixed in your autolyse. It's where all of the enzymatic activity starts to kickstart and into really lovely fermentation. And it is also the stage whereby, as a byproduct, we produce CO2, some lovely lactic acid, some lovely acetic acid, and of course, a tiny bit of alcohol. But this is where we want to really get to grips with how we can develop and help this dough to really utilize its scaffolding, which is the gluten structure, to build a really nice, tall skyscraper that's really well-rounded. So we can do that by a series of folds. And folds are essentially a process by which we fold our dough until it springs back at us. So it comes out really extensible, and then we fold it to create a nice, tight, elastic dough again. What happens during fermentation and during the production of all of this lovely CO2 bubbles is that our gluten network starts trapping these CO2 bubbles, almost like little balloons. And we want to organize those by these series of folds. So essentially, by doing a fold, we are trapping in our balloons bit by bit into another layer and another layer and another layer. And this happens throughout a period of time, sometimes by doing 2 folds, 3 folds, 4 folds, or even up to 6 folds. Everyone has their different technique. I tend to do between 2 and 4 folds. That depends on how my dough looks, what kind of dough I make. But for this particular beginner's dough, we're going to be doing 4 folds every half an hour for the first 2 hours of our bulk fermentation time. The bulk fermentation time starts as essentially at the minute you add the starter to your autolyse dough, and will finish once the dough has increased in size and volume by 30%. Now, how do you know that's done that? Well, it's as simple as that. Try and use a glass bowl and essentially make a little marker indication or rubber band if you have one that's large enough to know exactly where your dough was right at the beginning of bulk fermentation time. And then it should increase by 30%. That's the time where you're going to take your dough out and we're starting our pre-shaping. That's going to be in the next video. Now, there's a few factors that influence our bulk fermentation time, and one of them is temperature. And I know I've talked about temperature in the introduction and how important it is to know what your temperature is in your room and what your temperature is in your dough. The warmer your dough is and the warmer the room temperature is, the shorter the bulk fermentation time will be. Equally, the colder the room temperature and the colder your dough is, the longer the bulk fermentation time will be. You can find specifics of exact hours, well, not quite exact hours, but at least good ballpark figures for yourself in that lovely booklet of yours. And you can also get some indications of what other variables might influence your bulk fermentation time. One more important one to add is the amount of starter you've added. Adding more starter will speed up your bulk fermentation time, whereas adding less starter will basically mean that time will be a little bit longer, and it will just take a longer time for your fermentation to really start getting kick-started into the process. I tend to go for a specific percentage, which you've got in your recipe to hand, and I go for about 20% of starter for my total flour weight. That's a good in-between number that helps you in an environment for around 22 to 24 to 25 degrees. If you are in a particularly hot environment, use a little bit less starter. If you are in a particularly cold environment, use a little bit more starter. More on those figures you can find in your book again, where I've given you some ideas of exactly how you can change those percentages up. Folds essentially are a means to develop more dough strength. We are trying to organize our gluten web and we're trying to trap in the air bubbles so that we can make sure we get a really nice gassy dough that's full of nice air so it can nicely expand in the oven later on. So let me do a fold and show you exactly how I do it. and then also show you the temperature of the dough at the moment, which is something that's a key part of baking and sourdough bread. So we're nearly at my happy desired target temperature of 26 degrees, which is the best temperature for fermentation. Just doing one more fold right now. This is an hour in now, and you're going to continue with folds every 30 minutes until 2 hours, and then we're going to leave it to the end of the bulk fermentation time. I just want to show you one more time what this looks like and how it's changed over the last half an hour. So we're now 2 hours in, and it's time for the last fold in my opinion. So I've looked at my dough, and what I can see is that there's definitely an increase. There's fermentation, there's a little bit of activity. It's perfect because if you have an actual glass bowl, you would be able to see exactly what's happening with your particular dough. You can make a little mark and you can see the increase in fermentation and size of the dough. I've got my normal bowl here, so I can see right now it's increased in size, it's really fermenting, and actually my last fold, I can still see slight indications of my last fold. This tells me that I'm now coming towards the end of developing my dough structure. This will be the last fold I'm doing. After this time, I'm going to leave my dough undisturbed for another probably hour in this particular environment with my particular temperatures. But you at home might actually have a different environment, different temperatures. You might have it warmer or colder than me. And remember how I talked about the role of temperature, how it might take longer if you have a colder environment, how it might be a little bit shorter than me if you have a hotter environment than me. I'm keeping mine exactly at 26 degrees, so I'll probably be done exactly at around 3 to 3.5 hours. So once this is done, we're going to move into the next stage, which is going to be pre-shaping. So the bulk fermentation time is over now. I can see that my loaf has increased in volume by about 30%. You can see it looks gassy, it looks nice and fermented. It's retained its shape a little bit, so it hasn't fallen back into shape, which tells me it's really developed nice strength. And right at the end of that, I'm doing one last test, which is the window pane test. Here I'm really judging whether I've created enough gluten structure for my dough to now be pre-shaped. And that's a really important part because you want to make sure that you don't cut that too short. So once this is done, we're going to move into the next stage, which is going to be pre-shaping.